And the entrepreneur in me said, if 8 billion people think that living more sustainably makes their life worse, but I can lead them to where they actually find it's better by their own standards, not mine, because it's their intrinsic motivations, not mine. This may be the largest unmet demand in history.
In today's conversation, we're looking to really do a combination of inspire and challenge our thinking around sustainability and particularly our role in what that might actually look like. And so I have Josh Spodek joining me today, who has quite the resume. I've done a little shortened version for you, Josh. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Josh, he has a PhD in astrophysics and an MBA from Columbia. He's a professor at NYU, host of an award-winning podcast, author of best-selling books, and a 4 times TEDx speaker. So I think we aren't going to run out of things to talk about, Josh. I think that's probably safe to say, but thank you so much for joining us and letting us pick your brain a little bit today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me on.
I'm wondering if you can start us off today. You have this beautiful way that you describe leadership in your work, and you say that it's about helping people do what they already wanted but haven't figured out how. I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about what that journey's been like for you. Bring that to life for us in terms of your own work and sustainability and starting to put that into practice in your world from your, I was going to say obsession, I think that's probably a fair word, obsession for sustainability to be a leadership personal journey. Tell us a little bit of that story and where that came from for you.
So I was getting my PhD in the 90s, and some old friends of mine from college approached me and said, hey, entrepreneurship was in the air. Why don't we start a business? When I was running that business as CEO, I wouldn't have thought this at the time, but I didn't have any leadership skills. So then years later, I went to business school. Now, I went to business school not to learn leadership. I went to business school to get rich. But in business school is where I learned that there were classes in leadership and I could learn social and emotional skills. Now, in school, I learned that I could learn social emotional skills. I didn't actually learn the social emotional skills. After business school, a friend of mine was starting a school that was in project-based learning, experiential learning. And I took that type of learning and applied it to leadership. And I realized that it worked much more effectively. So I started to learn the actual practice of leadership, the social and emotional skills that I don't learn from the reading and writing papers. I learn from practicing the basics. I view leadership as a performance art. Meanwhile, throughout my entire life, parallel to all of this was the environment there was no time in my life when I didn't know about plastic, about deforestation, about extinctions, about sea level rise, about global warming. I knew about all these things. And I also knew what I did and it didn't matter. I knew only governments and corporations could act on the scale that we needed. I knew that if we acted and no one else did, then they could beat us in the market and we'd end up in the Stone Age. The message I got was, you have to sacrifice, you have to make your life worse here and now so that possibly, but possibly not, someone far away at another place at another time might benefit, but might not. But even if they do benefit from you, this tiny little thing that you do, it might be big in your life, but it might be tiny and affect them. For them, even if it does help, you need something way bigger than you could ever do to actually make a difference. So that would wipe out whatever you do anyway. And the rational response to that is don't act. And that was me for most of my life. So nonetheless, I looked at my garbage in my apartment and I said, whatever I can or can't do, whether anyone else acts or not, this garbage is going to hurt people and no one else can take responsibility but me. And so I challenged myself to go for a week without packaged food. There's a whole story behind that. Years later, looking back, I realized that I wanted the experiment to fail. I wanted to show, look, what I do doesn't matter. Yeah, it's not worth it. Yeah. And I tried. Now I don't have to try anymore. The opposite happened. I found that I liked the experience. Well, okay. There was several months of really bland food, of broccoli on lentils. And it wasn't, a little salt and pepper, but I did like not hurting people and I didn't like bland. So gradually over time, I developed a cuisine that was my cuisine that I really loved. Like I loved more than I ever did before. I thought before that it would cost more time, cost more money, that it wouldn't help people who didn't have a farmer's market nearby. Instead, cooking doesn't take more time. Not knowing how to cook, that's what takes time and money. So once I learned I saved time, saved money, helped people who didn't have access, more convenient, better tasting food. So what I really picked up on was not the material stuff, as interesting as that was. It was intrinsically rewarding. 10 years ago, this big shift happened. The leader in me said, no one's leading, and there's a huge opportunity to lead. And I don't personally benefit immediately, but in the long run, I do, because I care about humanity and myself down the road. And the entrepreneur in me said, if 8 billion people think that living more sustainably makes their life worse, but I can lead them to where they actually find it's better by their own standards, not mine, because it's their intrinsic motivations, not mine. This may be the largest unmet demand in history. Well, there's the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach, both. Everyone hears one and they think, oh, well, you're not doing the other. So the bottom-up approach is I've developed these workshops that teach the leadership technique that I've developed called the Spodek Method to lead people to where they enjoy acting on their intrinsic motivations in a way that increases the world's sustainability. And I teach them so they can bring it to others.
It's an interesting one. And you touched on this idea, which I totally agree with, around taking that bigger systems approach of top down, bottom up, like not just having a one-dimensional approach to trying to crack this issue that you're working on. But I do love the way that you talk about systemic change begins with personal change. And I think while those that are listening are in a category of being business leaders, whether they own the business or they're in the executive of a small to medium-sized business, I'm really keen today for you to help us do some of that dancing between those two spaces of thinking about ourselves and what we have control over as an individual person, and then taking that into, okay, well, what would this mean in my business? So you gave that great example of saying you can rattle off all the reasons that you think you know that mean you shouldn't act, but then you went to, well, I can take responsibility for the amount of rubbish I'm creating in my own apartment. So if we start there with this idea of systemic change beginning with personal change, are there some stories that you could tell us of people who have been through your workshop or leaders you've worked with that might be helpful as that role model you talked about for other business leaders listening, where that personal beginning of what motivated them, what was that intrinsic driver, how could they act today? I'd love to hear a few of those stories.
I want to give one of the biggest examples in history. Thomas Jefferson was one of the great speakers and writers on freedom, and he owned slaves. And to this day, people still say, well, he didn't mean all men are created equal. He meant all white men are created equal. He didn't believe it because he owned slaves. If you read his notes on State of Virginia, it's the most racist garbage. He's saying things like Africans mated with orangutans. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. This is not a man of science. This is a man of guilt and shame trying to reconcile, to sleep at night, living against his own values. George Washington owned slaves, freed them when he died. Benjamin Franklin freed them while he was alive and also started anti-slavery societies. Robert Carter III, not as well known, friends with all of them, he freed all of his slaves, gave them land. That is a role model that we can live by. He had to wait for the law to change. His neighbors hated him for it, but he lived a wonderful life and free of this internal conflict. And that internal conflict plagues us today horribly. People can say, oh, it doesn't affect me, but scratch the surface. And there's this really internal stuff. Like we see flooding over there and we say, well, when it affects me directly, I'll act. But it's affecting us now, especially if we have kids. If we want to look our kids in the eye and say, I'm making the world as safe and healthy and secure as I can for you. I talk about mosquito problems and flat tire problems. If you're trying to get work done and there's a mosquito buzzing around, you can kind of swat at it and trying to get away, and you still work on what you're doing. And it's kind of a bother, but you can try to keep working. If you're riding your bike and you get a flat tire, you can't act like, oh, it's no big deal. You have to get off the bike and fix the problem. You don't just keep going. And our environmental problems, we've been treating them as a mosquito problem for 50 years, 100 years. So there's a lot of people trying to make their companies a bit more efficient. Now, if you make a polluting system more efficient, you pollute more efficiently. And so a lot of what we're doing is what I call stepping on the gas, thinking it's the brake, wanting congratulations. But I put to you, there is huge opportunity. If we bust the myth that living more sustainably makes your life worse, if I take all the opportunity I possibly can get, that's not going to get to 8 billion by myself. So I'm happy for people to find other ways of stopping what they're doing. I'm not saying everyone has to do this. I'm saying the opportunity is there. And if you want to be Oscar Schindler, so that years from now, people make movies about you, if you want to have a legacy of changing culture, If you want to be like Muhammad Ali, who opposed the draft and became the first well-known person in the United States to oppose the Vietnam draft and became the greatest of all time. I mean, he was just the heavyweight boxing champion of the world and a wonderful poet. But when the Supreme Court ruled in his favor and he beat the US government, that's a pretty big win. If people want to go down in history like that, there's huge opportunities to do something new and desired, huge demand.
If we come back to, say, in that first piece around the distinction of different slave owners' approach to addressing that dissonance between their values and their actions or behavior, I think I like that example because it helps with this aspect of there's a direct connection between part of that, of the personal change, what is a decision I'm currently making or a way I'm living, and then because that slave owning one actually played out into how they made their money, the business side of what they ran. I think that's a good example for the people who are listening to this podcast, because it's that entry point. And I know that you talk a lot about examples like learning the basics or the scales in music and those elements. And I think those examples are helpful for us to start to go, okay, what do I have control over? Where am I already making decisions or already spending money that I could change? Because it removes that excuse of going, well, I can't change that because it relies on these external factors. But making the connection then to how it will affect the business can be a good way to start to make this feel less overwhelming. Because I think the same as your example with the cooking, where you said for a few months it was bland and a bit gross because you didn't know how to cook. It wasn't because it would always be that way, but you had to learn new skills. That still isn't disempowering because you can learn new skills. And I think some more kind of examples of that gap, if you like, before maybe the fun and ease and joy came into it, skills people have been able to learn. Are there some more examples where you've had feedback from people that you could share with us around, similar to your food one of the cooking? Like, where are those things where it might seem a bit scary at first, but we can learn a new skill or a new way of living?
A couple of big points. One is that practical, hands-on, personal experience. Without it, you just don't know what you're talking about in a performance art. So if people are flying around to climate conferences, they're hitting the piano with a sledgehammer. It's making some noise. It's not music. The Spodek Method that I teach, the first thing it does is work on the mindset shift. If you believe that what you're doing doesn't matter, if you believe that it has to be a burden, if you think that living more sustainably makes your life worse and you want more sustainability, that path leads to dictatorship. It leads to authoritarianism because you have to get people to do stuff they don't want to do. If you believe, as I do, that it makes your life better from personal experience of myself and others, that path leads to leadership, entrepreneurship, marketing, and sales.
I always talk to people about the fact that when you've spent your whole life, because most of us who are in certain positions have strong patterns and lived history of always being the person who takes responsibility or steps up or does things, and those patterns of being the person that's looked to and has the answer can be tricky for some to then be willing to go back to being a novice or doing something simple. And I think it can get in the way of, if they can't see a direct connection to, and this is exactly how it's going to make sense for the company at this big level, then it's not a step worth taking. But you're right, that just beginning that process then filters out into other opportunities, other conversations that over time build up to having a bigger impact within the company.
So for all the people watching, we forgot to mention this, that I'm living off the grid here in Manhattan. And let's see, can we see me better now? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
So, is it? Oh, no,
we've used all your power, Josh.
Yeah. So my battery powered light up there, it's in the Northern Hemisphere, the winter solstice yesterday. So it's dark. It's nighttime here.
Yeah. Well, it's daytime in Australia. It's night for you. And we've used all your battery of the light there.
Yeah. So now we're using my phone. So is this making my life worse? The smile on my face is because it's kind of silly, but it's not. And I'm learning what people have to learn. I got off the bike and I'm figuring out what's wrong with the tire. I want to tell another story about another guy who, he was a lawyer and he came to me and he ended up starting a nonprofit. And the nonprofit, I don't know if people there know Y Combinator. It's a Silicon Valley incubator. Okay. He got picked by Y Combinator for his nonprofit. They only briefly did nonprofits. I think they've stopped doing it. But he said something that Paul Graham, the Y Combinator guy, said: if you want things to scale, you have to start by doing a lot of things that don't scale. And it may sound counterintuitive. So all of these basics, going back to what your question about systemic change, systemic change begins with personal change. I say, I didn't make that up. There's personal change. That's practicing the basics.
What are some of the examples with the people that you've worked with where they've found that entry point, the basics that they're practicing, the scale? So you've given us some of yours around reducing the waste in your home, going off the grid. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other examples that might sort of grab someone's mind and they go, oh, I could start there? Because I think, I get your music example, and I think of, one of my kids in particular who's incredibly musical and he plays like literally 12 instruments. He can pick anything up and he's just extraordinary. But if you don't naturally have the ear he has, there's things that are obvious to him that aren't obvious to someone else. So for people who might be listening and going, I hear you, what are those basics? Because they're not yet drawn to some of the ones you've said. Can you sprinkle in a few other entry points?
I have to go in a different direction here.
Okay.
In my experience, that question is a wonderful question. It's sort of like asking, what's something you could do to, kick your heroin habit? In sustainability, you have to have the mindset shift first. There's a lot of people out there, virtually everyone has some view of sustainability makes your life worse. Deprivation, sacrifice, it's leading to the Stone Age, a Mad Max dystopia. If we live more sustainably and China and Russia don't, they'll come in and they'll beat us in the market. They'll beat us militarily. I'll never get to see my mom again because she lives flying distance away. We're going to die at 30. All the diseases are going to come back. We won't have antibiotics. We won't have anesthesia. If you believe any of those and you see a video with the turtle with a straw in its nose and someone says, avoid straws, you might say, all right, I don't want the turtle to get hurt. I'll avoid the straws. If more steps in that direction lead to Mad Max, they'll pay lip service to doing things, but they'll sabotage future steps and they'll think if you suggest living more sustainably and they know that leads to the Stone Age, they're not only going to not listen to you, they're going to sabotage and they're going to say, you're a moron. I know better than you. And you sound nice with your little virtue signaling, but I know where this leads and it doesn't lead where you think it does. And so I'm not going to listen to you anymore.
So what would be a better way for someone to then have that entry point into finding out what practicing the basics looks like for them? How do we get there?
The mindset shift. The step-by-step, this is like the equivalent of how to play scales. Likewise, if you want to learn how to play music, you first play the mechanical stuff. And then it transforms into playing music if you play it enough, even though at the beginning you're just doing mechanical things. So at the beginning, the Spodek Method there's a script that you follow that asks people what does the environment mean to them? And everyone is unique. If you grow up by the beach, it's different than if you grow up in the mountains. If you have pets, it might be different than if you have kids. Or, everyone has their own experience that's deeply personal to them. And if I talk about the park at the end of the block where I grew up and you had a beach that you used to walk to, I can't motivate you based on my stuff. Mm-hmm. So I have to listen to the other person, hear what they say, find out the emotion if it's you and your beach. Is the emotion freedom? Is it awe? Is it wonder? Is it feeling connected? Is it you? I have to listen to you share those things. And then part of the Spodek Method, and there's a script that leads to this, is to invite the person to think of something they can do to manifest those emotions, to bring them into their life. Now, they won't be able to recreate that childhood experience of jumping in the waves with their father or whatever, but they can create something. And there's a constraint when they do it that it has to, something they haven't already done, something that they do themselves. But the big one is that it has to leave the world better than they found it in some way. That's a value we used to have. Leave it better than you found it. A lot of people have a lot of trouble with that. But if they do something from intrinsic motivation that leaves things better than they found it, almost invariably, when I talk to them after it happened, they share that they did more than they said they would, and they're open to doing more. Now, I don't care if the first thing they do is big or small. I don't care about the y-intercept.
Yeah. I
care about the slope.
Mm-hmm.
And if they like what they did and they want to do it more, they could have done something trivial at first. The next thing's going to be a little bigger, and the next thing's going to be a bit bigger. and they're going to keep doing it because they want to for their intrinsic reasons. So if you ask me what to do, that would deprive them of coming up with themselves what they do. And if they're doing it to comply with me, it undermines the whole thing.
So if people sit with that aspect of not having to know what the basics might be yet or what the next 15 steps are, but saying it's the curiosity to just explore that driver or something that lights them up or feels it would intrinsically motivate them to seek out that experience or feeling or sensation again that comes to their mind in asking those questions.
Reflection on your own doesn't seem to work. Having someone walk you through it, a social conversation, someone holding you to it, it's really easy to let yourself off the hook by yourself or just get lost in thought.
Yep.
I left out the 6 months from between when I had the idea of avoiding packaged food and when I actually started that week. That was 6 months of analyzing and planning and feeling like I was productive. Oh, I'm figuring out exactly what to do.
I'm doing something, yes.
What worked was really doing it.
Yeah.
No, I didn't have the mindset shift for me came after that. It was only after I analyzed things later that I got lucky. Well, I'd done other things before that didn't click. That clicked, and that led me to develop this leadership technique. And so you said curiosity. Sometimes it's curiosity. Sometimes it's wonder and awe and, the divine or family or community. There's lots of different ways that it can connect, lots of different emotions it can connect with. But it's always something that people like. What I've learned from doing the Spodek Method so many times is that not everyone loves playing musical instruments. Not everyone loves sports. Some love one, but not the other. Some love both. Mm. Some people love dance. Some people love singing. Everyone has a deep, resonant connection with the environment. And that connection is motivation. And the more that they do, the more gratitude they express.
I hear you about the not wanting to lay out specifics. Like we don't want to do the checklist of unless you do these 17 things, you're not doing it right. But I would love some more examples or stories that might help spark something in people. So I'm wondering if we take a different angle. There's another section in the book where you talk about, there's a phrase where you say, you tell me what you fear losing and I'll tell you what you'll gain more of. Yeah. If we now come at it from that angle and we said, so there's looking for the intrinsic motivator, but then let's go all the way back to the beginning of the conversation when you talked about the fact that we've got this unquestioned belief there of, sustainability will equal deprivation. It will be taking away from me. Could we try and use this idea of tell me what you fear losing and I'll tell you what you'll gain more of? I fear losing connection with my family if I stop flying. Your response of what they're going to gain more of, what would that be?
Time with family. People who fly the most spend the least time with family. They live the farthest away from their families. They think of the flight that takes them to the family, but they don't think about the flight that takes them away from family. There's this really, really weird thing that people who fly a lot say, like, you're so privileged for not flying. It's really crazy. It's like we rationalize and justify to sleep at night despite this internal conflict inside of us.
That's human nature. Yep.
I'll give you an example of Evelyn. She is a mother of 3.
What was she afraid of losing? Like, what was her answer to the fear of losing was?
It was going to take away time from the boys.
Okay. Because she'd now need to be like, it'd take longer to do the shopping and the cooking and those types of things? Was
all sorts of things like that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll give you a couple examples. It was some of the stuff that resonated with her. Where she lives in Oregon, United States, biking made a little more sense. So she started biking more. And biking meant instead of driving, so she's got, the boys are with the ex sometimes. So they got to transfer them back and forth. And instead of driving to pick up the boys, she would take the bus to pick up the boys. After a little while, she said to the ex, can you just stick them on the bus and I'll just meet the bus when it arrives? Which, when I was a kid, I took the bus to the subway to school and back.
Absolutely.
And I think now in the US, I think people fear they might go to jail if they put the kids on a bus like that.
It's hilarious.
They're plenty old enough to do this. So the boys are maturing. It's been no problem. And now she has all these pictures of her with the boys on the bikes next to her. And she's just talking to me about how what it's like some night of the week is they have some board game that they just start liking, and the screens are going away. Like she's not making rules, no screens. They just don't have time for it because they're spending time together. The boys learning how to cook. That wasn't the goal. The goal was just her to live by, to manifest these values. And as a side effect, more time with boys, more quality time, less screen time, more maturity. Oh, here's another oddball side effect. She says that she's the most fit she's ever been in her adult life. Like she's lost a lot of weight. That wasn't the goal. That's a side effect. By her becoming a member of her community, like a visible person, people stop her and they want to talk to her. And one of the things, and I guess this is a few months ago now, they're just like, oh, I see you go by all the time. And the guy just reaches into his garden and is like, here's a bunch of zucchini. And so she's like, just people give her stuff because they like what they see. Unbelievable. My book goes into a lot of this about how dominance hierarchies form and why we're stuck with these beliefs and so forth. If I'm extreme, if they see me as extreme, I don't know many people who have their phone, like their battery powered light goes off in the middle of I'm not going to buy new stuff because I don't want more stuff. Yeah, I get that most people aren't like this, but most people didn't free their slaves. Like to be normal at Jefferson's time would be like, how many slaves are you going to keep so that you don't seem extreme? I'd like to think people would free all of their slaves.
Yeah.
And give them land and so forth.
But also there's the aspect of perspective, and you touched on this briefly before, of when we say, oh, well, you're very privileged to not have to fly, and yet the statistics would actually say it's only a tiny group of people who are the privileged ones who live away from their families in the first place, because most people are close to them. So we've made up a narrative there about why we can't do something that's not actually true. And I would say the same thing with, connected to seeing your choices as extreme. If you looked at the bulk of the world's population, I grew up with a mother who always said, compare yourself. If you have running water and electricity, you're in the richest of the rich. So stop comparing yourself to everyone around you. There's a much bigger world out there. And I think the running out of power, I've had the privilege of working with people in lots of different countries and have people doing that. Oh, we haven't had power for the last 48 hours. Oh, we haven't, like that is actually most people's experience. So within a context of living in a city like New York, there's uniqueness there. But you're right. I think we have made something seem normal and essential that actually for most of human history has not been the case.
Jefferson viewed having slaves as normal and essential, and it was extreme to free your slaves. Future generations will see us with the clarity that we see them. I think they knew inside. They were saying, we're bringing them to civilization and we're bringing them Jesus, and they're not human, or they're human but not quite. And future generations will see that what we're saying, the plane was going to fly anyway, what do I do doesn't matter. That's coming from this. I'm not saying that slavery and pollution are the same thing, but the internal conflict is similar.
The logic of, yeah.
And the logic would be, if you put that in
logic
quotes.
/ justification, yeah.
Yeah, I think motivated reasoning, it's coming from the same place in order to sleep at night.
Yeah.
And we don't want it. We want freedom from that. And also for people who fly, to talk about not flying is a privilege. All right, if you're addicted to heroin and you want to kick the habit, the last place to get advice is from your dealer, especially when your dealer is himself or herself addicted. The last place is to go for advice on sustainability. Washington, D.C., Wall Street, academia, Silicon Valley. Advice from there, unless they're actually hands-on practical personal experience like what I'm doing, that's the worst. That's the most counterproductive advice you're going to get. I mean, think twice before taking advice on sustainability from anyone from Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C., or the equivalent of each the government of each place. The park near where I live, Washington Square Park, is overrun with heavy drug use. And so I spend time with them because what's going on here? And mostly they don't talk to me, but they've all got their story, and if one of them tries to stop, the rest of them pull them back in again, because from their perspective, stopping means withdrawal. It means vomiting and pain. And so if you stop polluting, the people who pollute the most are like, oh my God, you must be suffering. You're going to go through withdrawal. Let me help you by bringing you back into owning slaves, today's equivalent of it.
Yes, which I think there's a quote in your book where you talk about living sustainably isn't hard. Living sustainably when no one else is hard. And I think that's that piece you're just talking about there of like, how do you begin to shift who you're getting the advice from, who is around you that's supporting and creating an enabling environment for what you want to be doing and how you want to be living, not the pieces that you'll otherwise be fighting against.
That's why, yeah, when you do start, even if you do it solo and you're doing tiny little things, you end up sharing it with people. And it seems to be around 5 or 6 people that if you lead 5 or 6 people through the Spodek Method and everyone's doing their, no matter how trivial the effect is on the world, that seems to be enough to where you feel like you're swimming downstream. Yeah. And that effect of pushing against culture, you still will be pushing against culture.
There's also a nice difference that with some of the examples that you've given and that approach, if people's hesitation is, well, I don't want to be forcing or, shoving something down other people's throats. As you do this, even your example of, I think it was Evelyn, riding the bike and someone seeing you consistently enough that they're like, oh, do you want some zucchinis or whatever? It's like the conversations that emerge come out of observation and curiosity. So you're being asked to share, not forcing. And there's a difference there both around who it draws, but also the openness and genuineness of a conversation that isn't defensive in the same way as it would be if you're forcing it.
If you really believe that you're bringing something that someone doesn't want, I don't want to tell you to start doing things. You got to have the mindset shift first. But once you have the mindset shift, you want to bring it to people. You want to learn sales.
I think one of the bits as we sort of wrap up that I loved in the book, there was a section that I'll just read briefly. So there's some quotes where you're talking about this concept of us using the phrase that we're asleep at the wheel. So you say, the vast majority of US companies are asleep at the wheel when it comes to tackling climate change, reported The Guardian a decade ago. Last year, The Hill reported, DC is asleep at the wheel when it comes to the climate. Everyone seems to think someone else is at the wheel, just not acting. Yet no one is steering. And the next sort of piece to kind of leave that with, which I loved, was you had in bold, no one is asleep at the wheel, no one is at the wheel. And as we kind of wrap up, I think getting each of us to really sit with that idea that it's not someone else, it's not waiting for someone else, bringing right back to this idea of systemic change begins with personal change. We don't have to have all the steps mapped out. There will be this beautiful, you've used words like joyful, fun, life-giving, all of those aspects that we can't anticipate yet. But what is our willingness to sit and explore what that intrinsic motivation might be to identify somewhere to start? That's what I would love people to kind of do, because like you, I genuinely believe that from that place, their own version of a snowball or the ripple effect is going to happen, because they will now have that driver to go, oh, what else could happen here? Where else could I take this? So I really hope that people can, even after listening, can just take some time to kind of sit and ask some questions that they might have just taken as a given and assumed were true before. That meant they couldn't act, and explore this. So we're going to share some links to Josh's work and book. Books, you got plural, but I do encourage you to, even if it's just checking out the download that Josh mentioned and using some questions as a prompt. Start somewhere and figure out what that might look like for you. And Josh, are there some final words you want to leave with us? Is there something you want to either challenge or encourage us on as we step into what this might look like for us in 2025?
If when this goes up, the how-to guide is not up for free download, just contact Bessi. I'll send her the PDF. And the best thing I can say is take the workshop. I'm not trying to, and the workshop.
Yes, because you can go into detail then.
Yeah, there's a price to it, but no one is turned away for paying what's appropriate for them. And it's a wonderful experience. Here's one of the biggest things. Everyone who comes in and says, I'd like to, but I don't have time, I don't have money. Afterward, they say, this saves me time and money. because there's a huge shuffling around of priorities, and people inevitably drop stuff that was wasting their time. It happens every time.
Yeah.
Living by your values gives you energy, and it saves you time, and it saves you money. So
Completely agree.
if you don't have time and money, that's a reason to do this. I can't tell you the middle steps, but it'll happen.
Thank you so much, Josh. Really appreciate it. And as I said, we will share some links. Reach out to me if you've got questions or you can't find something, or otherwise, Josh, where is your preference for people to connect with you?
So in the short term, it's joshuaspodek.com, but in the long term, it'll be spodekmethod.com.
Beautiful. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you for being willing to sit in the dark with us on an evening for you in New York. And we hope that this really is something that starts to raise some, not just the questions, but some different action and exploration for people listening. So thank you so much.
Thank you for tolerating my being in the dark.
It's perfect. All good.